In January 1968, America was confident it was winning the war in Vietnam. Generals were proclaiming that victory was just around the corner. The president urged the public to remain steadfast. But then, under the cover of darkness, 84,000 enemy soldiers launched a surprise attack, seizing cities, invading hallowed ground, and destroying the belief in progress. This is the hidden narrative of the Tet Offensive. Not only the fierce battle for Hue, but also the failure of intelligence, the political repercussions, and the fierce urban combat that turned a tactical win into a strategic disaster. The Tet Offensive of 1968 became a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War, with consequences that rippled far and wide. Although the Communists faced severe defeats on the battlefield, the Tet Offensive delivered a significant psychological win for them at a strategic level, setting in motion the events that would lead to Richard Nixon's election, the long and bloody exit of the United States from Southeast Asia, and ultimately, the fall of South Vietnam. To grasp how and why this occurred, we must first rewind to the previous year. After more than 2 years of grueling fighting, many Americans felt that the war had devolved into a bloody deadlock. General William Westmoreland, the senior U.S. commander in Vietnam, viewed it differently. By his main measure, body count, U.S. and Allied forces were making substantial gains against the enemy on the battlefield. In a meeting with his top officers in October 1967, he stated, "Our strategy has achieved success, evidenced by the fact that the enemy has not secured a single significant tactical victory over the past year. His guerrilla ranks have been steadily diminished, and numerous main force units have been eliminated." Back home, however, the perception of the war was starkly different. A public opinion poll from September 1967 revealed that, for the first time, more Americans opposed the war than supported it. By this time, President Lyndon Johnson's approval rating had fallen below 40%, hitting a new low since he took office. Anti-war protests continued to swell. In October 1967, 35,000 demonstrators marched on the Pentagon. It became evident that the American public was becoming increasingly divided over the war. Even among those who favored the war effort, many were frustrated with the president's failure to develop a winning strategy in Southeast Asia. The president, aware that the anti-war movement was shaking his public support and facing re-election in 1968, knew he couldn't overlook the growing unease among voters. Concerned about public sentiment, Johnson initiated a media campaign aimed at persuading Americans that the war was turning in their favor and that the administration's strategies in Southeast Asia were effective. Dubbed the Success Campaign, officials seized every chance to counter the belief that the war was at a standstill, emphasizing that progress was indeed being made. As part of this push, the president summoned Westmoreland back home in mid-November 1967 to advocate for the administration's stance. At various events, the general did just that. Upon arriving at Andrews Air Force Base, he told waiting reporters, "I have never been more encouraged in the 4 years that I have been in Vietnam. We are making real progress." Just 2 days later, during a television interview with CBS News' Steve Rowan, he expressed confidence that American troops could start withdrawing within 2 years or less. In a speech at the National Press Club, he claimed, "We have reached an important point where the end begins to come into view." He concluded by stating, "Victory lies within our grasp. The enemy's hopes are dim. With your support, we will deliver a success that will not only affect South Vietnam, but every emerging nation around the world." Westmoreland later admitted that he felt pressured to fulfill the public relations role, but he still presented an optimistic view of the war, firmly believing that a turning point had been reached. His remarks set expectations among the American public that would soon face a harsh reality. Meanwhile, while Westmoreland spoke, the Communists were busy finalizing plans for a nationwide offensive intended to break the stalemate and liberate South Vietnam. The decision to launch this major offensive came after years of internal debate and struggle over both policies and military strategy within the Communist ranks. These discussions primarily focused on when to shift from a prolonged engagement to a more aggressive approach aimed at winning the war. By this time, Le Duan, who had been instrumental in organizing the resistance, By 1967, Le Duan, the Secretary General of the Lao Dong Party in Hanoi, became increasingly critical of the prolonged war strategy. The conflict wasn't progressing as the communists had hoped, primarily due to the deployment of large numbers of American troops, which curtailed North Vietnamese infiltration and resulted in significant losses in the south. To Le Duan, the aggressive American tactics early that year suggested that a prolonged approach to the war was unlikely to succeed. Nonetheless, two areas of potential weakness for the Allied forces had surfaced. The South Vietnamese army was still facing considerable challenges, and it was evident that American public support for the war was beginning to falter. For these reasons, Le Duan promoted a more assertive strategy aimed at hastening the war's conclusion. Le Duan found support from several allies, notably General Nguyen Chi Thanh, who led the Central Office for South Vietnam, the main military command in southern Vietnam. Thanh aligned with Le Duan, advocating for a bold new strategy. He called for a large-scale offensive against South Vietnam cities, employing local guerrillas, main force Viet Cong, and regular North Vietnamese troops. In contrast, General Vong Nguyen Giap believed the timing wasn't right for such an all-out offensive. Ultimately, Le Duan and Nguyen Chi Thanh's approach prevailed over the more cautious advocates of a drawn-out conflict. At the 13th plenary session in April 1967, Resolution 13 was adopted, calling for a spontaneous uprising to achieve a decisive victory as swiftly as possible. As the plans for the forthcoming offensive evolved, Nguyen Chi Thanh died of a heart attack, but the preparations continued. Giap was on medical leave and had gone to Hungary, leaving the responsibility of planning the offensive to his deputy, General Van Tien Dung. With this new offensive, the Communists aimed to secure a decisive victory. The offensive plan, known as Tong Kong Kich Tong Koi Nia, or General Offensive, General Uprising, was intended to spark a widespread uprising among the people of South Vietnam, devastate the South Vietnamese armed forces, dismantle the Saigon regime, and persuade the Americans that the war was unwinnable. At a minimum, the leaders in Hanoi aimed to set themselves up for any future negotiations, aligning with their strategy of fighting while negotiating. The goal was to launch the offensive at the start of Tet Mao Than, the New Year of the Monkey in 1968, which occurred at the end of January. Dung's strategy included a preparation phase through the latter months of 1967. During this time, VC and PN forces initiated several attacks in the remote regions along South Vietnam's borders with Cambodia and Laos. The assaults at Loc Ninh, Song Bay, and Dak To, along with the siege of the Marine base at Con Thien just south of the demilitarized zone, drew Allied forces into these distant border areas. As part of this preparation, multiple PVN divisions would position themselves to threaten Khe Sanh, a remote Marine outpost near the Laotian border defended by a single Marine regiment. This area had already experienced intense fighting in 1967, as both sides battled for control of the high ground surrounding the Marine base. The North Vietnamese troop buildup in the late months of 1967 was designed as a clever distraction to pull U.S. forces away from more populated areas, which would be the primary targets of the impending general offensive in early 1968. The offensive plan itself called for a series of coordinated attacks on American bases and South Vietnamese cities and towns. General Dung specifically aimed at previously untouched urban centers like Saigon in the south, Nha Trang and Quy Nhon in central South Vietnam, as well as Quang Ngai and Hue in the north. Dung's strategy hinged on three key assumptions. First, he believed the ARVN wouldn't fight back strongly when hit. Second, he thought the Saigon government lacked support from the South Vietnamese people, who would rebel against President Nguyen Van Thieu if given the chance. Third, he assumed that both the population and the armed forces of South Vietnam resented the Americans and would turn against them if the opportunity arose. While there's some debate among American scholars regarding the actual phases of the offensive, General Tran Van Tra, who led the communist forces in the South from 1963 to 1975, later asserted that the offensive plan included three distinct phases. Phase 1 was set to kick off on January 31, 1968. It involved a nationwide assault targeting South Vietnamese cities, ARVN units, American headquarters, communication hubs, and air bases, primarily executed by Viet Cong main force units. The hope was that the southern insurgents could sneak into their positions and hit key areas before the offensive commenced. If a general uprising did not happen or failed to topple the Saigon government, follow-up operations would unfold over the coming months to wear down the enemy, leading to either victory or a negotiated settlement. According to TRA, Phase 2 of the offensive launched on May 5th, while Phase 3 started on August 17th and wrapped up on September 23, 1968. For Hanoi and the NLF, the Tet Offensive was seen as a longer endeavor that extended beyond the immediate actions following the Tet holiday, contrary to how many American historians view it. U.S. military intelligence had some awareness of a large-scale communist attack in the works, but did not anticipate it happening during Tet or on such a wide scale. Nonetheless, several signs indicated a major strategic shift from the enemy. In late November, the CIA station in Saigon put together various intelligence signals into a report titled The Big Gamble. This wasn't a formal intelligence estimate or prediction. It was more of a collection of insights suggesting the communists were gearing up to escalate the conflict. The report also estimated enemy strength much higher than previously thought. Military analysts at the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, strongly disagreed, as they were reassessing their method of accounting for enemy capabilities and lowering their estimates. Despite the differing views, as more intelligence came in, Westmoreland and his team concluded that a significant enemy effort was likely on the horizon. All indicators pointed to an impending offensive, though most of the increased activity was noted along the DMZ and in remote border regions. By late December 1967, further intelligence indicated a considerable enemy buildup around the Khe Sanh area. With the main threat coming from the north, General Westmoreland directed much of his focus to the northern provinces. Concerned about developments at Khe Sanh and new intelligence reports, Westmoreland urged the South Vietnamese to call off the upcoming nationwide Tet ceasefire. On January 8, 1968, General Cao Van Vien, the head of the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff, informed Westmoreland he would attempt to limit the truce to just 24 hours. However, South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu warned that canceling the 48-hour truce would negatively impact the morale of both his troops and the South Vietnamese public. Still, he agreed to shorten it to 36 hours, starting the evening of January 29th. Typically, South Vietnamese soldiers returned home for the Tet holiday, and this would significantly influence the fierce battles ahead. On January 21st, the North Vietnamese initiated heavy shelling on the Marine base at Khe Sanh, leading to intense firefights between enemy troops and Marines in the surrounding hills. Westmoreland believed this marked the beginning of the long-expected general offensive. The parallels between the Khe Sanh situation and the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 only heightened the urgency of the events unfolding there. In response, Westmoreland launched Operation Niagara II, a large-scale bombing campaign targeting suspected enemy positions around Khe Sanh. He also deployed the 1st Cavalry Division from the Central Highlands to Phu Bai, just south of Hue, and sent a brigade from the 101st Airborne Division to I Corps to bolster defenses in the two northernmost provinces. By the end of January, over half of all U.S. combat maneuver battalions were stationed in the I Corps area, poised to counter any emerging threats. In reality, the Allied forces were gearing up for the wrong battle. The Tet Offensive was described by National Security Council staff member William Jordan in a February 1968 message to Presidential Advisor Walt Rostow as the worst intelligence failure of the war. Many historians and observers have sought to unravel how the Communists managed to pull off such a remarkable surprise. Several potential explanations exist. First, Allied assessments of the situation were gravely miscalculated. The assessments of enemy strengths and intentions were deeply flawed. One issue arose when MAFV altered how it calculated enemy forces, and as a result, it reduced the estimates of Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam's strength by no longer including the National Liberation Front local militias. CIA analyst Sam Adams later accused MAFV of falsifying intelligence reports to depict progress in the war. While the truth of that claim remains disputed, it is clear that MAC-CV lowered the estimated enemy numbers from nearly 300,000 to 235,000 in December 1967. U.S. military intelligence analysts seemingly accepted these revised figures and largely ignored the growing evidence that the Communists not only maintained significant combat capabilities, but also intended to use them dramatically. With these inaccurate intelligence assessments, senior Allied military leaders and most analysts seriously underestimated the enemy's capabilities and dismissed emerging intelligence indicators as they conflicted sharply with established beliefs about the enemy's strength. It was assumed that the enemy lacked the necessary resources to mount a nationwide campaign. One analyst later confessed that he and his peers had become mesmerized by statistics of doubtful validity, opting to trust those that indicated progress. These ingrained beliefs acted as blinders, complicating the perceptions of senior Allied commanders and intelligence officers when faced with intelligence that starkly contradicted their preconceived ideas. Another contributing factor to the intelligence failures during Tet relates to what we now refer to as fusion. The wealth of indicators from numerous sources across South Vietnam made it challenging to assemble a complete and coherent picture of communist activities. Analysts often struggled to integrate the cumulative information despite their responsibility for creating estimates that should have synthesized various indicators into a unified analysis. A significant part of this challenge stemmed from the lack of coordination among Allied intelligence agencies, many of which operated independently. They rarely shared information with one another. This lack of coordination and failure to exchange intelligence made it difficult to combine all the available data, hindering the ability to predict enemy movements and avoid being caught off guard by the impending offensive. Even if the Allied intelligence system had been better at merging information, it still would have faced conflicting reports that muddled the situation. While some intelligence suggested a large-scale offensive was imminent, other reports claimed the enemy was struggling significantly in the field and that their morale had dropped. It became challenging to discern which reports to trust. Moreover, some warning signs that should have raised alarms among analysts were lost amid the noise of more obvious threats. Faced with evidence of increased enemy activity near urban areas and borders, the Allies struggled to determine where, when, and how the main assault would take place. They ultimately failed, concentrating instead on the intensified actions at Khe Sanh and other remote locations. Westmoreland and his team did not anticipate a nationwide offensive, believing there might be a show of force, but expecting the enemy's primary focus to be on the northern provinces. When signs of North Vietnamese Army units gathering near Khe Sanh were confirmed with the attack on the Marine base on January 21st, it aligned with Westmoreland's expectations. Consequently, they interpreted the intelligence through the lens of their own beliefs, honing in on Khe Sanh while disregarding most other signs that didn't fit their established views on enemy capabilities and intentions. They found it hard to believe that the Communists would launch an offensive to seize towns and cities. These factors contributed to the Tet offensive catching them almost completely off guard. This was true despite a number of attacks occurring prematurely at 5 provincial capitals in the Second Corps Tactical Zone and Da Nang in the I Corps Tactical Zone in the early morning of January 30th. These initial attacks, now attributed to enemy coordination issues, at least provided a glimpse of what was to come. Some had their doubts, yet many in Saigon still thought these attacks were just a distraction from Khe Sanh. The following night, everything changed when the bulk of the Communist forces unleashed a relentless assault, remarkable for both its scale and surprise. Over 84,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers executed coordinated, nearly simultaneous strikes against major cities, towns, and military sites, stretching from the demilitarized zone in the north down to the Ca Mau Peninsula at the southern tip of South Vietnam. In the north, they targeted Quang Tri, Tam Kỳ, and Hue, along with U.S. military bases at Phu Bai and Chu Lai. In central Vietnam, they intensified their previous night's actions with new attacks in Tuy Hoa, Phan Thiet, and at American installations in Bong Song and An Khe. In the three-corps tactical zone, Saigon was the main focus, but assaults also hit the ARVN Corps headquarters at Bien Hoa and the U.S. 2 Field Force headquarters at Long Bin. In the Mekong Delta, the Viet Cong struck Vinh Long, My Tho, Can Tho, Din Tuong, Kien Tuong, Gokong, and Ben Tre, along with nearly every other provincial capital in the region. The Communist forces shelled or launched rockets at every major Allied airfield and assaulted 64 district capitals, along with numerous smaller towns and villages. In total, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attacked 39 of South Vietnam's 44 provincial capitals, 5 of its 6 largest cities, including Saigon, 71 of 242 district capitals, around 50 hamlets, practically every Allied airfield, and many other crucial military targets, including all 4 regional military headquarters. An American general noted that the map of enemy attacks looked lit up like a pinball machine. In Saigon, 11 communist battalions, with over 4,000 troops, assaulted every major site in the urban area, including Tan Son Nhut Air Base, Independence Palace, which served as President Thio's office, the headquarters of South Vietnam's Joint General Staff, the Vietnamese Navy headquarters, and the national radio broadcasting station. Simultaneously, 3 Viet Cong divisions launched attacks on the American bases outside the city to block U.S. reinforcements from entering. Viet Cong sappers launched a bold raid on the U.S. Embassy, a 6-floor structure that had just opened in September 1967 at a cost of $2.6 million. Although the VC never breached the main building and were all eliminated by 3 a.m., their audacious mission dramatically highlighted that no location in Vietnam was safe from attack. Meanwhile, far to the north, the longest and bloodiest battle of the Tet Offensive commenced as 7,500 NLF and North Vietnamese troops stormed and seized Hue, the ancient capital once home to the emperors of the Kingdom of Annam. Both sides held Hue in high esteem, and it had remained largely untouched by war until now. The city actually comprised 2 areas, the modern section to the south of the Perfume River, and the Old City, or Citadel, which featured beautiful gardens, pagodas, moats, and intricate stone architecture on the northern bank. In the early hours of January 31st, 10 battalions of VC and North Vietnamese forces simultaneously took control of both the new and old cities. The battle that ensued, where U.S. Marines and ARVN troops fought to reclaim Hue, would drag on for nearly 3 weeks, resulting in heavy losses for both sides. These striking assaults, which spanned from the DMZ to the southern tip of Cà Mau Peninsula, were unmatched in their intensity and scale. The onslaught caught everyone off guard, defying both key military assumptions and the optimistic reports emerging from the Johnson administration in late 1967. As journalist Stanley Carno notes, these well-coordinated attacks exploded around the country like a string of firecrackers. Back in the United States, news of the widespread offenses and vivid scenes of intense fighting stunned the American public. Television news anchor Walter Cronkite captured the sentiment perfectly when he questioned, "What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war." U.S. intelligence had indeed collected some information about infiltration into southern cities and had intercepted documents outlining a general strategy. However, Westmoreland and his intelligence team were so fixated on Khe Sanh as the primary target and so convinced that the enemy couldn't mount an offensive of this magnitude that the captured documents were seen as a distraction. Westmoreland's intelligence officer later admitted, "Even if I had known what was coming, it was so ridiculous that I probably wouldn't have been able to convince anyone." Westmoreland himself acknowledged he hadn't foreseen the true nature or the scope of the attacks. Because of this, the U.S. High Command seriously underestimated the enemy's capacity for a nationwide offensive, leaving the Allies initially overwhelmed by the boldness, scale, and intensity of the assault. In reality, the Tet Offensive was a tactical disaster for the Communists. Though the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong experienced early successes with their surprise strikes, the Allied forces quickly regained their footing, containing and pushing back the attackers in most regions. The initial wave of the offensive ended by the second week of February, with most battles wrapped up in just a few days. However, heavy fighting persisted in places like Con Tum and Ban Ma Thuot in the Central Highlands, Can Tho and Ben Tre in the Mekong Delta, while the Marines were still under siege at Khe Sanh. Intense battles raged for weeks in Saigon and Hue, but in the end, the Allied forces utilized their superior mobility and firepower to drive the Communists out, as they failed to secure any of their military goals. The anticipated uprising of the South Vietnamese people never happened. The Communists had planned on a general revolt to bolster their offensive, but when it didn't occur, they lost the initiative and were forced to either withdraw or face the consequences of the Allied response. During the fierce fighting that extended into the fall, the Communists suffered staggering losses. Conservative estimates suggest that around 45,000 Communists were killed in 1968, with an additional 7,000 captured. While the exact figures have been debated, it's evident that their losses were significant and continued to escalate as the fighting dragged into autumn. By September, after the offensive had concluded, the Viet Cong, who faced a heavy share of the fighting in the cities, sustained a major setback from which they never fully bounced back. From that point on, most of the fighting was carried out by the North Vietnamese army. The offensive led to a significant tactical defeat for the Communist forces. However, the ability of the enemy to execute such a large-scale offensive and surprise the Allies ultimately played a crucial role in their strategic victory. While U.S. and Allied casualties were notably lower than those of the enemy, they remained alarmingly high. On February 18, 1968, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, reported the highest casualty numbers for the U.S. in a single week throughout the war, 543 fatalities and over 2,500 injuries. From January 29 to March 31st, total U.S. casualties reached 3,700 killed and 11,000 seriously wounded, while the South Vietnamese experienced over 7,600 fatalities and 18,000 injuries. These staggering figures, along with the sheer scale and brutality of the offensive, shocked the American public, who were taken aback by the enemy's capability. They were not prepared for the intense and upsetting imagery broadcast on their screens, because military leaders and the administration had reassured them that the United States was winning and that the enemy was on the verge of defeat. Initially, there was a slight rise in support for the administration following the offensive's launch, but this was short-lived, and the president's approval rating soon fell dramatically. Many Americans, having believed the optimistic updates from military and government officials at the end of 1967, now felt that a resolution to the war was nowhere in sight. The Tet Offensive severely undermined the administration's credibility and intensified public dissatisfaction with the conflict. The impact of the Tet Offensive extended to the White House, deeply shaking the confidence of the president and his team. Despite Westmoreland's assertions that the Tet Offensive was a significant triumph for Allied forces, Johnson, like the American citizens, was taken aback by the Communists' ability to carry out such extensive attacks. One advisor later remarked on the air of gloom that enveloped the White House. When Westmoreland, backed by General Earl Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, requested an additional 206,000 troops to bolster efforts, it underscored the prevailing uncertainty. Taking advantage of the situation, the president hesitated and ordered a thorough review of U.S. policy in Vietnam by Clark Clifford, who was set to replace Robert McNamara as Secretary of Defense. According to the Pentagon Papers, a significant turning point had been reached, and the options became painfully clear. The Tet Offensive shattered the administration's united front concerning the war's strategy, and Clifford's reassessment opened the door for those options to be discussed. Civilians at the Pentagon proposed that the focus should be on securing the population and that South Vietnamese forces needed to take on more responsibility in the fighting, while the United States aimed for a negotiated end to the conflict. The Joint Chiefs, however, opposed this strategy, insisting that Westmoreland should receive the troop increase he had requested and be allowed to pursue enemy forces into Laos and Cambodia. After completing his study, Clifford recommended that Johnson reject the military's request and turn efforts toward de-escalation. Although he publicly maintained an optimistic front, Johnson realized that the current path in Vietnam was failing. His resolve for a policy change deepened after advice from the Wise Men, a group of respected senior statesmen who had previously backed the administration's Vietnam policies, urging that de-escalation should commence immediately. As these discussions unfolded within the White House, Congress stepped in on March 11th when the Senate Foreign Relations Committee began hearings on the war. The following week, the House of Representatives launched its own review of Vietnam policy. Meanwhile, public opinion polls showed a decline in the president's approval ratings and his management of the war. This tension was evident in the Democratic Party presidential primary in New Hampshire, where the president narrowly defeated challenger Senator Eugene McCarthy, prompting Senator Robert Kennedy to join the race as an anti-war candidate. Faced with political challengers from his party and still reeling from the shocking Tet attacks, Johnson addressed the nation on March 31, 1968. He announced a partial suspension of the bombing campaign against North Vietnam and called for negotiations. Then, he surprised the television audience with a startling announcement. He decided not to seek re-election. The Tet Offensive had taken its final toll. The following November, Richard Nixon secured the presidency and commenced the lengthy withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. Historians often hesitate to derive lessons learned from past events. History doesn't merely repeat itself. Too many variables are at play across different times. This is especially true when we compare the wars in Vietnam and Iraq. The differences outweigh the similarities, and because of these significant distinctions, trying to apply lessons from Vietnam to Iraq poses considerable risks. That said, there are some overarching insights from Vietnam that can guide U.S. actions, not just in Iraq, but in any current situation where the U.S. government or any national government considers military intervention. This is particularly relevant regarding the Tet Offensive of 1968. Two crucial and interconnected lessons arise from the Tet Offensive. The first emphasizes the need for objectivity in intelligence. Westmoreland and other high-ranking officials failed to see the signs that a nationwide offensive was on the horizon because those signs didn't fit their preconceived understanding of the enemy's capabilities and Allied progress. Even after the offensive began, the initial response at Westmoreland's headquarters was to interpret the attacks through their existing framework, mistakenly believing they were mere distractions meant to divert attention from the main objective at Khe Sanh. Military planners must keep an open mind about enemy capabilities and intentions, especially when indicators contradict earlier assessments. In the case of the Tet Offensive, intelligence mirrored Westmoreland's optimism rather than providing an accurate portrayal of enemy strength. This substantial intelligence failure allowed the Tet attacks to have a dramatic impact. The second lesson derived from the Tet Offensive is closely tied to the intelligence issue. Senior military leaders and policymakers must understand the importance of setting realistic expectations while resisting the urge to paint the military situation in overly favorable terms. Political and public relations motives drove Johnson and Westmoreland to create false expectations about the situation in Vietnam. Their goal was to gain support for how the administration was managing the war and to lessen the anti-war sentiment. These expectations, built on deeply flawed intelligence, significantly influenced the response to the Tet Offensive. The vivid images and reports of intense fighting contradicted the administration's claims of progress and widened the credibility gap to a breaking point. What began as a tactical victory quickly transformed into a strategic defeat for the United States, leading to a near abdication of the presidency. North Vietnamese General Tran Do reflected on this when he acknowledged the offensive's failure to achieve its main tactical goals, but noted the unforeseen impact it had on America, saying, "It had not been our intention, but it turned out to be a fortunate result." This impact arose because Westmoreland and the Johnson administration prioritized political motives over an honest assessment of the military situation. They used unreliable intelligence to create an image of enemy strength to rally public support. When the harsh realities of the Tet fighting came to light, the resulting loss of credibility for the president and military leadership in Saigon dealt a severe blow to both the Johnson administration and the Allied war effort. The Tet Offensive and its aftermath fundamentally transformed the conflict in Vietnam. What was perceived as a clear tactical victory in the field was interpreted as a defeat in the United States. It led many Americans to believe the war was unwinnable, effectively ended one presidency, compelled the new president to adopt a Vietnamization strategy, and set the stage for the ultimate success of communist forces in 1975. Reflecting on the lessons of the Tet Offensive, journalist Don Oberdorfer captured the sentiment perfectly when he wrote, "The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong lost a battle. The United States government lost something even more important, the confidence of its people at home." Forces arrived on the shores of Vietnam at Da Nang, supposedly to secure the U.S. airbase there. A month later, President Lyndon Johnson approved the deployment of U.S. ground troops for offensive combat operations in Vietnam. These events signified a notable shift in the United States' role in the ongoing conflict between the South Vietnamese government and their communist adversaries. Until that point, U.S. forces had been providing support to the South Vietnamese through advisors and air assistance. However, with the arrival of the Marines, a significant buildup of U.S. troops occurred, leading to 184,300 American soldiers stationed in Vietnam by the end of 1965. This number would surge rapidly, exceeding 319,000 by the close of 1967. Eventually, U.S. ground troops were deployed across all 4 tactical zones and engaged in combat against the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese counterparts, the People's Army of Vietnam. The first major clash between U.S. forces and PAVN troops took place in November 1965 during the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley. Over the following 2 years, U.S. forces executed numerous large-scale search and destroy missions, including operations like Masher, White Wing, Attleboro, Cedar Falls, and Junction City. These strategies aimed to locate and eliminate enemy forces in a war focused on attrition. Yet, by the end of 1967, the situation in Vietnam had devolved into a bloody stalemate. While U.S. and South Vietnamese efforts had inflicted considerable casualties and disrupted communist activities, the North Vietnamese persisted in sending troops into South Vietnam. Still, General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, remained optimistic about advancements. On November 21, 1967, he addressed the National Press Club in Washington and claimed, "We have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view. I am absolutely certain that, whereas in 1965 the enemy was winning, today he is certainly losing. The enemy's hopes are bankrupt." However, events in 1968 would prove him mistaken. The plan for the 1968 Tet Offensive was conceived in the summer of 1967. Facing frustration with the battlefield deadlock and reacting to the aggressive American strategies enacted the previous year, communist leaders in Hanoi decided to initiate a widespread offensive aimed at delivering a decisive blow to the South Vietnamese and their American allies. This campaign sought to break the deadlock and achieve 3 main goals: instigate a general uprising among the people in the South, dismantle the South Vietnamese armed forces, and persuade the Americans that the war was unwinnable. The offensive aimed at the South Vietnamese urban centers that had previously been untouched. The communists readied themselves for this major attack through a significant increase in troops and equipment in the South. At the same time, they executed a series of diversionary strikes on remote outposts to draw U.S. forces away from populated areas and into the countryside. In the fall of 1967, the strategy was put into action with communist assaults in regions south of the demilitarized zone, along South Vietnam's western edge in the Central Highlands. The principal phase of this initial offensive commenced on January 21, 1968, at Khe Sanh in northwest South Vietnam, where 2 PAVN divisions besieged the Marine base. Fearing a repeat of Dien Bien Phu, President Johnson insisted that Khe Sanh be defended at all costs. With attention focused on Khe Sanh, the Communists launched their main offensive in the early hours of January 31, 1968. Using the Tet ceasefire as cover, 84,000 North Vietnamese and VC troops initiated simultaneous attacks on 36 of the 44 provincial capitals, 5 of the 6 autonomous cities, including Saigon and Hue, and 64 of the 242 district capitals, plus 50 hamlets. Many South Vietnamese soldiers were on leave for the holiday, allowing the communist forces to achieve significant initial success. However, within days, all assaults on smaller towns and hamlets were repelled. Intense fighting persisted in locations like Kon Tum and Ban Mae Thuot in the Central Highlands, Can Tho and Ben Tre in the Mekong Delta, and even in Saigon. The longest and most brutal battle of the Tet Offensive took place in Hue, a city highly regarded in Vietnam. Situated along Highway 1, 10 kilometers from the coast and about 100 kilometers south of the DMZ, Hue was the capital of Thua Tien Province and the third largest city in South Vietnam, housing around 140,000 residents during the war. As the former imperial capital, Hue was a cultural and intellectual hub of Vietnam and had been treated almost like an open city by the VC and North Vietnamese forces, remaining relatively untouched by war. Though it had experienced sporadic mortar and rocket fire, Hue itself had remained largely peaceful and secure leading up to Tet in 1968. Nonetheless, the city was a key supply hub for the Allied forces stationed along the DMZ to the north, and it also functioned as a crucial unloading point for supplies brought in by boats from Da Nang along the river. Hue was essentially two cities separated by the Song Huong, or River of Perfume, which wound through Hue from the southwest to the northeast, eventually reaching the South China Sea just 10 kilometers away. Two-thirds of its residents lived on the north side of the river, within the Old City, or Citadel, a beautiful area filled with gardens, pagodas, moats, and detailed stone structures. Just east of the Citadel's walls lay the bustling district of Gia Hoi. The Citadel itself was a formidable fortress, initiated in 1802 by Emperor Gia Long with French assistance and inspired by the Forbidden City in Peking. It was once home to the Annamese emperors ruling central Vietnam and spanned 3 square miles. This complex encompassed 3 concentric cities, featuring a network of easily defensible positions. The outer wall soared 30 feet high and measured up to 40 feet in thickness, forming a square of about 2,700 yards on each side. 3 sides were straight, while one gracefully curved to align with the river. The walls not adjacent to the river were surrounded by a zigzag moat, 90 feet wide and reaching depths of up to 12 feet. Many sections of the wall were riddled with bunkers and tunnels built by the Japanese during their occupation in World War II. Inside the citadel were rows upon rows of houses, parks, villas, shops, and various structures, including an airstrip. Within its confines was the Imperial Palace compound, where emperors once held court until 1883, when the French regained control of Vietnam. Positioned at the southern end of the citadel, the palace was essentially a square with 20-foot-high walls measuring 700 meters on each side. While the citadel and the Imperial Palace were a camera-toting tourist's dream, they would soon reveal themselves as a rifle-toting infantryman's nightmare. South of the river, connected to the citadel by the 6-span Nguyen Huang Bridge that carried Route 1, was the modern part of the city. This area was about half the size of the citadel and housed roughly a third of the city's population. The southern portion of Hue was home to the hospital, the provincial prison, the Catholic cathedral, and many modern buildings, including government offices, the U.S. consulate, Hue University, the city's high school, and newer residential neighborhoods. The 1st Infantry Division of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was based in Hue, but most of its soldiers were stationed along Highway 1, extending from Hue north towards the DMZ. The division's headquarters was situated at the northwest corner of the citadel, within a fortified area, enclosed by walls that stood 6 to 8 feet high, topped with barbed wire. The nearest South Vietnamese unit was the 3rd ARVN Regiment, comprising 3 battalions and located 5 miles northwest of the city. A 4th ARVN battalion was operating several miles to the southwest. The only combat force within Hue was the division's Hoc Bao Company, known as the Black Panthers, an elite volunteer unit responsible for reconnaissance and rapid response. The National Police primarily handled security within the city. When the battle commenced, the sole U.S. military presence in Hue was the Math V compound, which accommodated 200 U.S. Army, U.S. Marine Corps, and Australian personnel who acted as advisors to the 1st ARVN Division. They occupied a lightly fortified compound on the eastern fringes of the city, roughly a block and a half south of Nguyen Huang Bridge, near the river. 8 miles south along Route 1 lay the nearest U.S. combat base at Phu Bai. This base served as a significant Marine Corps command post and support facility, housing Task Force X-Ray, established as a forward headquarters for the 1st Marine Division. Commanded by Brigadier General Foster C. Frosty Lahue, Assistant Commander of the 1st Marine Division, the task force consisted of 2 Marine Regimental Headquarters and 3 battalions, the 5th Regiment with 2 battalions and the 1st Regiment with 1 battalion. Many of these troops, including Brigadier General Lahue himself, had only recently arrived in the Phu Bai area after being displaced from Da Nang and were still familiarizing themselves with the operational landscape when the Communists launched their assault on Hue. Alongside the U.S. Marines, there were also U.S. Army units present, with 2 brigades from the 1st Cavalry Division dispersed throughout the region. The area stretched from Phu Bai in the south to LZ Jain, just south of Quang Tri in the north. The 1st Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division had recently joined the 1st Cavalry and was arriving at Camp Evans, moving north from its previous operations. Opposing the Allied forces in the Hue region were 8,000 Communist troops, made up of 10 battalions, including 2 North Vietnamese regiments. These highly trained regular Army units had come south, likely through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They were equipped with AK-47 assault rifles, RPD machine guns, and B-40 rocket-propelled grenades. Additionally, they had a range of heavy weaponry, including 107mm, 122mm, and 140mm rockets, as well as mortars and recoilless rifles. The North Vietnamese forces were bolstered by 6 Viet Cong main force battalions, comprising the 12th and Hue City Sapper battalions. A standard main force VC infantry battalion included 300 to 600 experienced fighters, armed similarly to the Pay Yen, albeit with fewer heavy weapons. As the battle for Hue unfolded, the total Communist force surrounding the city would increase to 20 battalions, with the arrival of 3 more infantry regiments from the Khe Sanh battlefield. Before the Tet offensive began, the Communists had meticulously planned their assault on Hue, led by General Tran Van Quang, commander of the Tri Thien Hue Front. Their strategy involved a division-sized attack on the city, while simultaneously cutting off access to prevent Allied reinforcements. Quang and his commanders believed that once the city's residents recognized the strength of the Communist troops, they would rise up, joining the VC and PAVN against the Americans and South Vietnamese, driving them out of Hue. With detailed intelligence on civil and military sites within the city, the Communist planners divided Hue into 4 tactical areas and identified 196 targets. They intended to deploy over 5,000 soldiers to capture the city in a single decisive strike. Communist documents captured during and after the Tet Offensive reveal that enemy forces underwent extensive training in urban street fighting before launching their attack. While the PAVN and VC troops were skilled in jungle and rice paddy combat, they required additional training to tackle the unique challenges of fighting in cities. This preparation included a focus on both individual and unit tactics, aimed at offensive maneuvers to take control of the city, as well as defensive strategies to maintain that control once they gained it. As the troops readied themselves for battle, VC intelligence officers compiled a list of cruel tyrants and reactionary elements to capture in the early hours of the assault. This list encompassed most South Vietnamese officials, military personnel, politicians, American civilians, and other foreigners. Captured individuals were to be taken to the jungle outside the city, where they would face punishment for their perceived crimes against the Vietnamese people. The timing of the attack was meticulously chosen. With the Tet holiday approaching, the ARVN defenders were at a reduced strength. Additionally, the adverse weather conditions typically associated with the northeast monsoon season would hinder aerial supply operations and limit close air support, which could have offered the Allied forces in Hue a significant edge. The defense of the city significantly depended on Brig Gen. Ngo Quang Truong, the commander of the 1st ARVN Division, who was viewed by many U.S. advisors as one of the most outstanding leaders in the South Vietnamese military. A graduate of the Dalat Military Academy in 1954, Truong earned his position through merit and combat leadership rather than political connections or bribery, unlike many of his compatriots. On the morning of January 30th, the first day of the Tet holiday, Truong received reports of enemy attacks on Da Nang, Nha Trang, and other South Vietnamese installations during the night. Sensing trouble, he convened his division staff at headquarters and put them and his remaining troops on high alert. Unfortunately, more than half of his division was on holiday leave and not present in the city. Believing that the communists would steer clear of directly attacking the open city, he prepared for the unexpected. Truong arranged the remaining forces around the city's outskirts to defend it. This meant that when the communist assault began, the only regular ARVN troops present in the city were from the Hak Bao Black Panther Reconnaissance Company, stationed at the northeastern corner of the citadel to protect the airstrip. Unbeknownst to Truong, as he prepared for the impending situation, clear evidence pointed to a direct strike on his city. On the very day, South Vietnam's commander alerted his staff. A U.S. Army radio interception unit at Phu Bai picked up communist directives signaling an imminent assault on Hue. Following protocol, this unit relayed the message through regular channels. However, this information encountered several layers of command and didn't reach the defenders in Hue until the city was already under siege. While the intelligence report was still making its way through the chain of command, the Viet Cong had already blended into the city. Dressed in civilian clothes, these troops intermingled with the celebrants who had gathered in Hue for the Tet holiday. They easily brought their weapons and ammunition into the city using wagons, truck beds, and various concealment methods. In the early morning hours of January 31st, these soldiers took their initial positions within the city, preparing to connect with the PEVVN and VC assault forces. At 3:40 a.m., the communists launched a rocket and mortar barrage from the western mountains, targeting both the old and new sections of the city. Following this attack, the assault troops began their offensive. The VC infiltrators put on their uniforms, met their comrades at the city gates, and led the charge on critical installations. The PA-VN 6th Regiment, supported by 2 battalions of infantry and the 12th VC Sapper Battalion, initiated the main offensive from the southwest, swiftly crossing the Perfume River into the citadel and heading toward the ARVN 1st Division headquarters in the northeastern section. The 800th and 802nd Battalions of the 6th Regiment quickly overran most of the citadel, but Truong and his staff successfully held off the attackers at the 1st ARVN Division compound. Meanwhile, the Hak Bao Company retained its position at the eastern end of the airfield. On several occasions, the 802nd Battalion almost breached the division compound, prompting Brigadier General Truong ordered the Black Panthers to pull back from the airfield to bolster his defenses at the compound. By sunrise on January 31st, the PA-VN 6th Regiment had taken control of the entire citadel, including the Imperial Palace. The only area still held by South Vietnamese forces was the 1st Division compound. Throughout the night, the PA-VN 802nd Battalion managed to breach ARVN defenses multiple times, but each time they were driven back by the Black Panthers. The situation was not much better for the Americans on the south side of the river in the new city. It could have been worse if not for a critical tactical misstep by the North Vietnamese. Instead of launching an immediate assault right after the rocket and mortar bombardment, they waited about 5 minutes, giving the defenders a chance to prepare. The PA-VN 804th Battalion attacked the Mass V compound twice, but both attempts were thwarted by the swiftly organized defenders armed with individual weapons. One U.S. soldier stood guard at an exposed machine gun position atop a 20-foot wooden tower. His fire halted the first wave of North Vietnamese sappers trying to reach the compound walls to plant satchel charges, but he was killed by a B-40 rocket. The PA-VN then rushed the compound gates, where they encountered a group of Marines manning a bunker. The Marines held their ground for a time, but ultimately, the PA-VN overwhelmed them with several B-40 rockets. This momentarily slowed the North Vietnamese assault and provided the Americans, along with their Australian allies, extra time to fortify their defenses. Following a fierce firefight, the communists were unable to capture the compound, leading them to resort to mortar and automatic weapons fire from nearby buildings. The defenders took cover and awaited reinforcements. Meanwhile, as the battle unfolded at the MAFV compound, two VC battalions seized control of the Thua Thien province headquarters, police station, and several other government buildings to the south. Simultaneously, the Pavan 8th Battalion set up blocking positions at the southern edge of the city to prevent any reinforcements from coming in that direction. By dawn, the North Vietnamese 4th Regiment had control of almost all of Hue south of the river, with the exception of the MACV compound. In just a short span of time, the communists managed to seize control of nearly all of Hue. When the sun rose on January 31st, nearly everyone in the city could see the blue and red National Liberation Front flag adorned with gold stars flying high over the citadel. It was evident that the communists had taken control of Hue. As the PAVN and VC troops roamed the streets, solidifying their gains, political officers instigated a reign of terror, rounding up South Vietnamese citizens and foreigners listed on special lists. VC officers marched through the citadel, using loudspeakers to call out names and instructing people to report to a local school. Those who failed to show up were hunted down. The detainees were never seen alive again. Their fate remained a mystery until U.S. and South Vietnamese forces later recaptured the citadel, uncovering nearly 3,000 civilians who had been massacred and buried in mass graves. As battles erupted in Hue, other communist forces launched attacks on cities and towns from the DMZ to the southern Ca Mau Peninsula, leaving Allied forces overwhelmed across the nation. The northern provinces were no different, making it challenging to gather enough combat power to drive the communists out of Hue. Furthermore, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops had been sent west to aid operations in and around Khe Sanh, diminishing the available forces in the entire northern region. This situation significantly affected the efforts to reclaim Hue from the communists. General Truong, who held only a fragile grip on his headquarters compound, commanded his 3rd Regiment, supplemented by 2 airborne battalions and an armored cavalry troop, to push into the citadel from the northwest. As they approached, they faced heavy small arms and automatic weapon fire. Despite the resistance, they fought their way through and reached Truong's headquarters late in the afternoon. While Truong attempted to consolidate his forces, another request for reinforcements went out from the surrounded MAFV compound. This call for help nearly got lost amid the chaos of simultaneous attacks throughout I Corps. Lieutenant Hong Xuan Lam, who led the South Vietnamese forces in I Corps, along with Lieutenant Robert Cushman, commander of the 3 Marine Amphibious Force, were both uncertain about the true situation unfolding in the city. The extent of the communist assault was somewhat unclear in the early stages of the battle, but Allied commanders soon recognized that reinforcements were essential to drive the communists out of Hue. As a result, Cushman instructed TF X-Ray to send support into Hue to aid the besieged MACV compound. As both ARVN and U.S. commanders attempted to evaluate the situation and prepare to send reinforcements, the North Vietnamese quickly set up additional blocking positions to hinder those forces from reaching the beleaguered defenders. The PIN 806th Battalion obstructed Highway 1 to the northwest of Hue, while the PAVN 804th and K4B battalions positioned themselves in southern Hue. Simultaneously, the 810th Battalion dug in along Highway 1 to the south of the city. In response to 3 MAF orders, Brig Gen Foster LaHue, who commanded Task Force X-Ray, sent Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, to move up Route 1 from Phu Bai by truck to assist the surrounded U.S. advisors. Initially, the report of the assault on Truong's headquarters and the MACV compound didn't alarm LaHue's headquarters significantly. The task force commander, lacking reliable intelligence otherwise, believed that only a minor enemy force had infiltrated Hue as part of a local diversionary tactic. He was unaware that nearly an entire enemy division had taken control of the city. Consequently, he sent only 1 company to manage the situation, and it would take time for LaHue to fully understand the scale of the challenge his Marines faced in Hue, even after receiving reports about the number of enemy troops in the city. He later noted that, initial deployment of force was made with limited information. Uncertain about what awaited them in the city, the Marines from A11 advanced north as instructed, linking up with 4 M48 tanks from the 3rd Tank Battalion along the way. The convoy encountered sniper fire and had to halt multiple times to clear buildings along their route. Once the convoy crossed the bridge over the Fukam Canal into the southern part of the city, the Marines found themselves immediately under heavy crossfire from enemy automatic weapons and B-40 rockets coming from all directions. They advanced slowly through intense enemy opposition, but became pinned down between the river and the canal, just short of the Massey compound they were sent to relieve. During the struggle, the company commander, Captain Gordon D. Batchelor, was wounded, along with several of his Marines. With Company A pinned down, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus J. Gravel, battalion commander of the 11 Marines, quickly organized a reaction force. This included himself, his operations officer, a few members of his command group, and Company G from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, which had just arrived in Fubai that very day. Gravel had never met Captain Charles L. Meadows, the commander of Company G, until that moment. He later recalled that the only order he had time to convey was simply, "Get on the trucks, men." With minimal details aside from the fact that their fellow Marines were in trouble, the relief team moved up the highway, bolstered by 2 self-propelled twin 40mm guns. They faced little resistance as they proceeded and joined forces with a company of the 11 Marines, now under the command of a wounded gunnery sergeant. Supported by 4 tanks and the 40mm self-propelled guns, this combined team fought its way to the Mathvi compound, reaching the overwhelmed defenders around 3:15 p.m. Yet, the cost was steep. 10 Marines were killed and another 30 were wounded. After linking up with the Massey defenders, Gravel received new orders from LaHue, instructing him to cross the Perfume River and push toward the ARVN 1st Division headquarters in the Citadel. Gravel pushed back, explaining that his battalion was down to just 2 companies, one of which was in rough shape, and that he would need to leave part of his force to defend the Massey compound. Regardless, LaHue, lacking a clear understanding of the enemy situation in Hue, insisted that Gravel go anyway. Diverting Company A to assist with the Massey compound's defense, Gravel took Company G, supported by 3 original M48 tanks and several from the ARVN 7th Armored Cavalry Squadron, and set out to follow LaHue's orders. He left the tanks on the southern bank to provide covering fire while he and his Marines attempted to cross the Nguyenhuang Bridge that led into the Citadel. As they began to cross, they were met with a barrage of gunfire from a machine gun position at the north end of the bridge. 10 Marines fell during the assault. Elsie Pell, Lester A. Tully, who went on to earn the Silver Star for his bravery, charged ahead and took out a machine gun nest using a grenade. Following Tully, 2 platoons made it over the bridge and veered left, skirting the river along the Citadel's southeast wall. They were immediately met with heavy fire from AK-47s, automatic weapons, B-40 rockets, and recoilless rifles positioned along the Citadel's walls. As mortar shells and rockets detonated around them, the Marines attempted to advance but soon found themselves pinned down by a surge of enemy fire. Gravel realized his unit was severely outnumbered and made the decision to withdraw. However, that proved to be a challenge. Gravel noted that the enemy was well entrenched and firing from virtually every building in Hue City north of the river. He called for vehicle support to assist in evacuating the wounded, but none were available. Eventually, the Marines seized some abandoned Vietnamese civilian vehicles and repurposed them as makeshift ambulances. After 2 grueling hours of combat, the company managed to retreat back to the bridge. By 2000 hours, the 1st Battalion had set up a defensive position near the Massey compound along a stretch of riverbank that included a park, which they quickly turned into a helicopter landing zone. The attempt by the Marines to cross the bridge came at a heavy cost. Among the casualties was Maj. Walter D. Murphy, the S-3 operations officer of the 1st Battalion, who later succumbed to his injuries. Captain Meadows, commander of Company G, lost 1/3 of his unit either killed or wounded, going across that one bridge and then getting back across the bridge. At Fubai, Despite detailed reports from Lieutenant Colonel Gravel, Brigadier General LaHue and his intelligence team lacked a clear understanding of the situation in Hue. He later stated, "Early intelligence did not reveal the quantity of enemy involved that we subsequently found were committed to Hue." Even when Marines on the ground reported their challenges, LaHue and his staff failed to appreciate the seriousness of the circumstances. The intelligence landscape in Saigon was equally murky. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, informed Gen. Earl Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that the enemy has approximately 3 companies in the Hue Citadel. Marines deployed a battalion to the area to eliminate the enemy presence. This consistent underestimation of the enemy's strength in Hue led to an inadequate number of troops being sent to reclaim the city. With Brigadier General Truong and the 1st ARVN Division busy in the citadel north of the river, Lieutenant Generals Lam and Cushman convened to strategize the division of responsibilities for retaking Hue. They ultimately determined that ARVN forces would tackle the communist elements in the citadel and the northern part of Hue, while Task Force X-Ray would focus on the southern area of the city. This created 2 separate battles unfolding simultaneously, one south of the river and the other to the north. As Lam and Cushman launched their efforts to reclaim Hue, they faced a distinct challenge. The historic capital was nearly revered by the Vietnamese people, especially among Buddhists. Destroying the city could bring about political fallout that neither the United States nor South Vietnam could afford to ignore. Cushman later noted, "I wasn't about to open up on the old palace and all the historical buildings there." Because of this, initial limits were placed on artillery and air support to reduce collateral damage. These restrictions were eventually lifted when it became clear that both artillery and air support were essential for dislodging the enemy from the city. Nonetheless, these early engagement rules played a significant role in the difficulties faced in the beginning days of the battle. After determining control over the city, Cushman, with General Westmoreland's approval, started organizing reinforcements to seal off the enemy within the city from any external support. On February 2nd, the 3rd Brigade of the U.S. Army 1st Cavalry Division joined the fight, tasked with blocking enemy access to the city from the north and west. They airlifted the 2nd Battalion, 12th Cavalry, to a landing zone about 10 kilometers northwest of Hue along Highway 1. By February 4th, the cavalry units maneuvered overland from the landing zone and set up a blocking position on a hill with a view of a valley roughly 6 kilometers west of Hue. This location offered excellent visibility of the primary enemy routes in and out of the city. During this time, the 5th Battalion, 7th Cavalry, carried out search and clear operations along enemy routes west of Hue. On February 7th, they encountered a well-fortified North Vietnamese force and spent the next 24 hours attempting to drive them out. However, the enemy remained steadfast, impeding the cavalry's advance with intense automatic weapons and mortar fire. On February 9th, the headquarters of the 3rd Brigade, 1st Cavalry Division, instructed 5/7 Cav to pin the Pavin in place while directing 212th Cav to attack northward from their position. Despite facing heavy resistance near the village of Thong Bon Thi, 212th Cav continued to push toward 5/7 Cav's location. For the next 10 days, both cavalry battalions engaged in fierce fighting against the entrenched communists, who held their ground against repeated assaults. Although the cavalry troopers were unable to dislodge the North Vietnamese, their efforts did manage to block the enemy's movements and limit their involvement in the ongoing battle in Hue. For nearly 3 weeks, U.S. cavalry units worked tirelessly to prevent the North Vietnamese troops from reinforcing Hue, specifically the Pa Ven 24th, 29th, and 99th Regiments. On February 19th, they received support when the 2nd Battalion, 501st Infantry joined the 3rd Brigade from the 101st Airborne Division and were ordered to secure access to the city from the south. On the same day, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, released from its base defense mission at Camp Evans, moved southward toward Hue. While these U.S. Army units engaged heavily in the surrounding areas and played a significant role in the eventual Allied victory at Hue, The combat within the city largely fell to South Vietnamese troops and U.S. Marines. As Allied reinforcements began to arrive, the ARVN and Marines started preparing for counterattacks in their designated zones. However, their efforts were hampered by worsening weather, which took a turn on February 2nd, with temperatures dropping into the 50s and heavy rain soaking the area. Amid the downpour, Lieutenant Colonel Gravel's bob-tailed 1st Battalion, 1st Marines received orders to advance and secure the Thu Tien Province headquarters building and prison, located just 6 blocks west of the Mac V compound. At 700, Gravel initiated a 2-company assault, backed by tanks, to capture his designated objectives, but the Marines quickly encountered problems. An M79 gunner from Company G recalled, "We hadn't gone a block away from the Mac V compound when we began to receive sniper fire. We got a tank, moved a block, turned right, and then got hit by 57mm recoilless fire, which took out our tank. The attack was stopped cold, and the battalion pulled back to its original position near the MACV compound." By this point, Brigadier General Lahui came to realize that he and his intelligence officers had significantly misjudged the strength of the communists south of the river. He summoned Colonel Stanley S. Hughes, the new commander of the 1st Marine Regiment, giving him overall tactical command of U.S. forces in the southern part of the city. Taking charge of the situation, Hughes assured Gravel he would send reinforcements and assigned him the overarching mission of conducting sweep and clear operations to destroy enemy forces, protect U.S. nationals, and restore that southern part of the city to U.S. control. In response, Gravel directed Company F, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, which had been placed under his command when it arrived the day before, to secure a MAP-V communications facility near the U.S. consulate, which was surrounded by a VC force. The Marines launched their assault, battling for most of the afternoon, but they were unable to reach the U.S. Army signal troops, suffering 3 Marines killed and 13 wounded in the attempt. At this point, Gravel's troops set up defensive positions for the night. During the night, Gravel planned to renew the attack the following morning. The next day, the Marines made some progress and received additional reinforcements. The 1st Battalion eventually relieved the MAP-V radio facility in the late morning after an intense 3-hour battle and reached the Hugh University campus. During the night, the communist sappers had destroyed the railroad bridge across the Perfume River west of the city, but left the bridge over the Phu Cam Canal intact. At 1100 hours, Company H, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, under Captain Ronald G. Christmas, crossed the canal bridge in a convoy that included Army trucks armed with quad 50 caliber machine guns and 2 Ontos, tracked vehicles equipped with 6 106mm recoilless rifles. As the convoy approached the Mafi compound, it came under heavy fire from enemy machine guns and rockets. The Marines reacted quickly, and amidst the chaos, the convoy mistakenly exchanged fire with another Marine unit already in the city. One Marine from the convoy recalled, "Our guys were on the right side of the road, but nobody knew that. Next thing you know, everyone started shooting at our own men out of sheer panic and confusion." Fortunately, neither Marine unit suffered any casualties. Company H joined Lieutenant Colonel Gravel at a position the 1st Battalion had set up near the Mac V compound. The PAVN and VC gunners kept up their barrage of machine gun and rocket fire on that position, resulting in 2 Marines killed and 34 wounded by the end of the day. On the afternoon of February 2nd, Colonel Hughes made the decision to move his command group into Hugh for better control of the battle. Accompanying him in the convoy was Letter Col. Ernest C. Cheatham, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, who had been frustrated in Phu Bai while 3 of his companies, F, G, and H, were engaged in the fight under Lieutenant Colonel Gravel. Hughes quickly set up his command post in the Massiv compound, with Cheatham's 3 companies and Gravel's reduced battalion, which included Company A from the 1st Battalion and a makeshift company with a platoon from Company B and several cooks and clerks who had been sent to the front lines to assist. Hughes wasted no time asserting control. He instructed Gravel to secure the left flank with his 1.5 company battalion to keep the main supply route open. He then ordered Cheatham and his 3 companies to take charge of the assault south from the university toward the provincial headquarters, telling him to push through the city and drive the NVA out. When Cheatham hesitated, seeking more guidance, the regimental commander, like everyone else entering Hugh with minimal information, snapped, "If you're looking for anything more, you're not going to find it. Move out." Cheatham crafted a plan for his battalion to head west along the river from the MacV compound, with Companies F and H leading the way and Company G in reserve. Although the plan was straightforward, carrying it out proved to be extremely challenging. From the MacV compound to where the Perfume River meets the Foucam Canal stretched nearly 11 blocks, each turned into a fortress by the enemy that had to be cleared one building and one room at a time. The Marines launched their assault toward the Treasury building and the post office, but progress was painfully slow, as they had yet to come up with effective tactics for navigating the complex urban landscape. While the Marines, backed by tanks, attempted to push forward, the Communists unleashed a relentless barrage of mortars, rockets, machine gun, and small arms fire from fortified positions in the buildings. According to Cheatham, his Marines attempted to seize the Treasury and postal buildings 5 or 6 times. He later reminisced, "You'd assault, then you'd fall back, carry your wounded with you, and then muster up the energy and courage to try again." The Marines simply didn't have enough manpower to tackle the entrenched enemy in the buildings. The front line for a company covered about 1 block, and with 2 companies pushing forward, it left an unprotected left flank vulnerable to enemy automatic weapons and rocket fire. By the evening of February 3rd, the Marines had made minimal progress and were suffering increasing casualties, fighting over the same contested ground repeatedly. The next morning, Colonel Hughes gathered his 2 battalion commanders. He ordered Cheatham to persist with the attack and instructed Gravel to continue supporting Cheatham's left flank with his battalion, which now had only 1 company available due to the previous day's toll. As Gravel dispatched his Marines into position to cover Cheatham's assault, they had to first secure the Joan of Arc school and church. They quickly encountered heavy resistance from the enemy and were compelled to engage in a house-to-house battle. They eventually gained control of the school, but continued to take effective fire from Pavan and VC shooters positioned in the church. Reluctantly, Gravel issued the command to fire on the church, and his Marines unleashed a barrage of mortars and 106mm recoilless rifle rounds, finally neutralizing the threat. Among the wreckage of the church, the Marines discovered 2 live European priests, 1 French and 1 Belgian, who were outraged by the attack. While Gravel regretted the destruction, he felt he had no other choice. With Gravel's Marines now in place to guard his left flank, the fight continued. At 7 a.m. on February 4th, Cheatham initiated his assault towards the Foucam Canal. After 24 exhausting hours of fierce combat, they finally reached the Treasury building. The Marines launched their attack from the rear by blasting through the walls of the adjacent courtyards with 106mm recoilless rifle fire. They captured the facility only after it had been pummeled by 90mm tank rounds, 106mm recoilless rifles, 81mm mortars, and ultimately CS gas. As the weather worsened, the Marines found themselves engaged in a grueling fight, struggling to secure an 11-by-9 block area just south of the river. What began as an operation quickly turned into a nightmare. The close-quarters battle against a well-entrenched enemy was starkly different from the warfare for which they had been trained. Used to the open fields and sparse countryside of I Corps, nothing in their preparation had equipped them for urban combat. Captain Christmas later recalled his anxiety as his unit prepared to enter the battle for Hugh. He described feeling a knot in his stomach, not just from fear, though that was certainly present, but because of their inexperience in such a situation. They were trained for jungles and open rice paddies, not for fighting in a city like it was Europe during World War II. He noted that one of the strengths of the Marines is their ability to adapt quickly, but he anticipated they would suffer significant casualties while learning these fundamental lessons. The fighting was brutal, house-to-house combat through city streets, unlike anything Americans had witnessed since World War II. Progress was measured in inches, and every city block was bought at a high price. with each alley, street corner, window, and garden demanding blood. War correspondents accompanying the Marines described the intensity of this combat as the most severe they had ever witnessed in South Vietnam. The fighting was unyielding. Small groups of Marines moved determinedly from house to house, attacking enemy positions with whatever support they could muster, blasting through walls with rocket launchers or recoilless rifles before sending fire teams into the openings. Every building had to be cleared room by room, utilizing M16 rifles and grenades. The PAVN and VC took full advantage of Hugh's many courtyards and walled estates, ambushing the Marines at every turn. With no training in urban combat, the Marines had to devise their tactics and techniques on the ground. Early on, they faced a significant challenge due to the lack of detailed maps. Initially, they relied on standard tactical maps at a 1 to 50,000 scale, which didn't capture the city's intricate details. One company commander jokingly noted, "You have to raid the local Texaco station to get your street map. That's really what you need." Eventually, Cheatham and Gravel managed to secure the necessary maps and identified government and municipal buildings, along with key city features, allowing for better coordination of their efforts. Complicating matters further was the initial restriction on artillery and close air support. The Marines had access to a wide array of heavy weaponry, including 105mm, 155mm, and 8-inch howitzers, helicopter gunships, and naval fire support from nearby destroyers and cruisers. However, due to the initial engagement rules aimed at minimizing city damage, these resources were unavailable at the outset of the battle. Even after Lieutenant General Lamb lifted the ban on fire support south of the river on February 3rd, the Marines still struggled to rely on air or artillery support because of the close quarters and low-lying cloud cover. Lieutenant Colonel Gravel later highlighted some of the challenges. Artillery in an area like that is not terribly effective because you can't observe it well enough. You lose the rounds in the buildings in the street, and you have a difficult time with perspective. The poor weather also hampered close air support and affected artillery usage, since rounds needed to be adjusted by sound when visibility was obscured by clouds and fog. The Marines had other forms of firepower at their disposal. They deployed tanks to support their advance, but found them unwieldy in tight spaces and often targeted by anti-tank fire whenever they moved forward. In contrast, the ONTAS, equipped with 6 106mm recoilless rifles, was much more effective in direct fire mode, successfully suppressing enemy positions and creating openings in buildings for the Marines to push forward. The Marines utilized everything available to them, including their favored 106mm recoilless rifle, in their effort to dislodge the PAN and VC forces. This progress was slow, methodical, and came at a high cost. On February 5th, a particularly fierce battle unfolded when Captain Christmas' H-25 Marines captured the provincial capital building in Thua Tien. Supported by 2 tanks and the 106mm recoilless rifles mounted on mechanical mules, the Marines pushed forward under heavy automatic fire, along with rockets and mortars. In response, they unleashed their own mortars and CS gas, eventually overwhelming the defenders by mid-afternoon. The provincial headquarters had taken on significant symbolic value for both sides. A National Liberation Front flag had been flying from the pole since the Communists first took control of the city. As a CBS television crew recorded the moment, the Marines removed the enemy flag and hoisted the stars and stripes in its place. It was a politically delicate moment. The Marines were supposed to turn the headquarters over to the ARVN and continue their campaign. Yet, Captain Christmas declared to his gunnery sergeant, "We've been looking at that damn North Vietnamese flag all day, and now we're going to take it down." For Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham, this marked a pivotal moment in the battle for Hugh, stating, "When we took the province headquarters, we broke their back. That was a rough one." This headquarters had served as the command post for the Pavan 4th Regiment. Its fall began to weaken the North Vietnamese defenses south of the river, but the fighting was far from finished. Even as the Marines quickly adapted to street combat, it wasn't until February 11th that the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, arrived at the point where the river and canal converge. 2 days later, they advanced into the western suburbs of Hue, aiming to connect with troops from the 1st Cavalry and 101st Airborne Division who were moving toward the city. By February 14th, most of the area south of the river had fallen into American hands, but it would take an additional 12 days to carry out mopping-up operations as rockets and mortar rounds continued to rain down, while isolated snipers troubled Marine patrols. Ultimately, control of this section of the city was handed back to the South Vietnamese government. The toll was heavy for the Marines, with 38 killed and 320 wounded. The cost had been even higher for the Communists. Over 1,000 VC and PAVN soldiers lay lifeless across the city south of the river. While the Marines battled for the southern section, fierce fighting continued north of the river. Despite the U.S. unit's efforts to block Hue from outside support, Communist troops and supplies still flowed into the city from the west, north, and even via boats on the river. On February 1st, the 2nd ARVN Airborne Battalion and the 7th ARVN Cavalry managed to retake the Taylock airfield within the citadel, but not without significant losses, including their cavalry squadron commander and 12 armored personnel carriers. That same day, U.S. Marine helicopters transported part of the 4th Battalion, 2nd ARVN Regiment, from Dong Ha into the citadel. Upon landing, the ARVN pushed forward but struggled to dislodge the North Vietnamese. By February 4th, their progress north of the river had largely come to a standstill, trapped among the buildings, alleys, and narrow streets next to the citadel walls. The Communists retained control of the Imperial Palace and much of the surrounding territory. On the night of February 6th to 7th, the PAN launched a counterattack, forcing the ARVN back to the Taylock airfield. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese reinforcements flooded into the city. Brigadier General Truong acted by repositioning his forces, directing the 3rd ARVN Regiment to enter the citadel and secure positions around the division headquarters. By the evening of February 7th, Truong's troops in the citadel included 4 airborne battalions, the Black Panther Company, 2 armored cavalry squadrons, the 3rd ARVN Regiment, the 4th Battalion from the 2nd ARVN Regiment, and a company from the 1st ARVN Regiment. Despite bolstering his forces inside the citadel, Truong's troops struggled to make any progress against the entrenched North Vietnamese, who had fortified themselves within the walls and closely packed buildings. Throughout this, the PAVN and VC appeared to grow stronger as more reinforcements entered the city. With his forces stalled and feeling embarrassed and frustrated, Truong had no choice but to request assistance from 3 MAF. On February 10th, Lieutenant General Cushman sent a message to Brigadier General. LaHue directed him to reposition a Marine battalion to the citadel. He ordered Major Robert Thompson's 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, to get ready to move to Hue. On February 11th, helicopters transported 2 platoons of Company B into the ARVN HQ complex, but the 3rd platoon had to turn back when their pilot was hit by ground fire. A day later, Company A, accompanied by 5 tanks and the missing platoon from Company B, crossed the river using landing craft, traversed the moat east of the citadel, and broke through a gap in the northeast wall. The following day, Company C joined the battalion. Once inside the citadel, the Marines were tasked with relieving the 1st Vietnamese Airborne Task Force in the southeast section. Meanwhile, 2 battalions of Vietnamese Marines entered the southwest corner of the citadel with orders to push west. This concentration of Allied forces increased pressure on the Communist troops, yet they remained resolute in defending their positions. The next day, after discussions with President Nguyen Van Thieu, Lieutenant General Lam granted permission for Allied forces to use any necessary weapons to force the enemy out of the citadel, with the exception of the Imperial Palace, which remained off-limits for artillery and close air support. The mission for the 1/5th Marines was to advance down the east wall of the citadel toward the river, with the Imperial Palace to their right. At 8:15 a.m. on February 13th, Company A set out through a biting rain, following the wall toward a distinctive archway tower. As they approached, North Vietnamese troops opened fire with automatic weapons and rockets from concealed positions at the base of the tower. The sturdy masonry shielded the enemy defenders from the onslaught directed at them. In just minutes, several Marines lay dying, and 30 more were wounded, including Captain John J. Bowe, Jr., the company commander. These troops, recently deployed from operations in Fulak just north of the Hai Van Pass, were not familiar with the situation or urban combat. Surrounded by houses, gardens, stores, and multi-story buildings, they felt out of place on the paved roads cluttered with abandoned vehicles. Under intense enemy fire, the Marine advance came to a halt. During the first assault on the south wall, they suffered 15 fatalities and 40 injuries. Major Thompson pulled back Company A and replaced them with Company C, supported by Company B. Once again, the Marines were caught in heavy small arms, machine gun, and rocket fire coming from all sides, yet they pressed on, relying on airstrikes, naval gunfire, and artillery support. The fighting was even more ferocious than during the battle for the South Bank. That night, Major Thompson called for artillery fire to soften the area ahead of the next day's assault. At 8 a.m. on May 14th, Thompson launched another attack, but his Marines struggled to gain ground against the entrenched North Vietnamese and VC. It wasn't until the following day that Captain Myron C. Harrington's Company D from the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, was brought in by boat and finally succeeded in taking the wall tower, though at the cost of 6 more Marines' lives and over 50 wounded. That night, the PAVN briefly recaptured the tower, but Captain Harrington led the counterattack to reclaim it. On the morning of February 16th, Major Thompson's Marines pushed southeast along the Citadel wall. From that moment until February 22nd, control of the area swung back and forth while much of the Citadel was reduced to rubble by air support, artillery, and heavy weapon fire. Intense hand-to-hand combat raged on without pause. The Marines found themselves in a defender's paradise, surrounded by rows of single-story, thick-walled masonry houses, tightly packed against a solid wall filled with spider holes in enemy positions. They soon realized that the North Vietnamese units in the Citadel used superior city-fighting tactics, enhancing their already strong defenses, digging trenches, building roadblocks, and launching counterattacks to reclaim key positions crucial to their defense. The young Marines charged into the buildings, tossing grenades ahead of them and clearing one room at a time. This was a battle fought inch by inch. Each enemy stronghold was dismantled through close-quarters combat. No sooner had they secured one position than the North Vietnamese would fire from another. M48 tanks and Ontos were on hand, but these tracked vehicles struggled to navigate the narrow streets and tight alleys of the Citadel. Initially, the 90mm tank guns struggled to penetrate the concrete and stone houses. Their shells often bounced off the thick walls, heading back toward the Marines. In response, the Marine tankers switched to concrete-piercing fused shells, which allowed for impressive penetration, enabling them to breach the walls with just 2 to 4 rounds. The tanks became crucial in supporting the infantry assault. One Marine rifleman remarked, "Without the tanks, we wouldn't have made it through that part of the city. The North Vietnamese seemed to have bunkers everywhere." As the fierce fighting continued, Hue was reduced to rubble, block by block. By the battle's end, estimates indicated that 10,000 homes were either completely destroyed or damaged, which accounted for roughly 40% of the city. Many dead and wounded remained trapped in the rubble-filled homes and courtyards. Enemy troops who were killed by the Marines and South Vietnamese lay where they had fallen. One of the MACV advisors noted, "The bodies, bloated and infested with vermin, drew rats and stray dogs. Due to public health concerns, teams were formed to bury the bodies as quickly as possible." The gruesome sights and foul odors of the dead and the rats would linger in the minds of those who fought in Hue. By February 17th, the 1/5th Marines had suffered 47 killed and 240 wounded in just 5 days of combat. Under continuous fire, the Leathernecks, exhausted and fatigued, pressed on, often catching only 3 to 4 hours of sleep and barely stopping to eat. The intensity of the fighting made it extremely challenging for medics and doctors to manage the influx of casualties. To fill the growing ranks of the wounded, Marine replacements were brought in during the battle, but many were killed or injured before they even got to know their squad leaders. Some replacements arrived in Hue straight from completing their infantry training at Camp Pendleton, California. The rapid turnover was evident, as there were Marine KIAs still wearing their stateside fatigues and boots. On February 18th, with what remained of his battalion completely worn out and nearly out of ammunition, Major Thompson decided to give his troops a chance to rest before launching a renewed attack. They needed time to recover. They cleaned their weapons, replenished their ammunition, cared for the wounded, and prepared for the next round of fierce combat. The following morning, Thompson and his Marines launched their attack toward the Imperial Palace once more, advancing slowly and paying a heavy price for every inch gained. After enduring 24 more hours of relentless fighting, they finally secured the wall on February 19th, but it had come at a great cost. As the U.S. Marines continued their slow march toward the Imperial Palace, the Vietnamese Marine Task Force joined the fray. At 9 a.m. on the 14th, the South Vietnamese initiated their assault from an area south of the 1st ARVN Division headquarters to the west. Their plan was to sweep left and take the southwest sector of the citadel, but they quickly encountered fierce resistance, plunging into intense house-to-house combat. Over the next 2 days, the South Vietnamese managed to advance barely 400 meters. Meanwhile, to the north, the 3rd ARVN Infantry Regiment faced its own setbacks in the northwest sector of the citadel. On the 14th, enemy forces surged from their position west of the Tay Loc airfield, effectively cutting off the 1st Battalion, 3rd ARVN Regiment in the citadel's western corner. It would take 2 days for the ARVN to break free from this encirclement, only after enduring grim fighting. Meanwhile, it became clear that the enemy was also struggling. On the night of February 14th, a U.S. Marine forward observer embedded with ARVN troops inside the citadel, while monitoring enemy radio frequencies, discovered that the PAN was preparing a battalion-sized attack through the west gate of the citadel. The observer swiftly called for Marine 155mm howitzers and all available naval gunfire on pre-designated targets around the west gate and the moat bridge leading to it. The observer reported hearing screaming on the radio while tapping into the PAV net. Subsequent radio intercepts confirmed that the artillery and naval fire had struck the North Vietnamese battalion as it crossed the moat bridge, resulting in the death of a high-ranking North Vietnamese officer and a significant number of newly deployed troops. Not long after this incident, U.S. intelligence determined that the PAN and VC were operating out of a base camp located 18 kilometers west of the city. Reinforcements from that region were entering the citadel through the west gate. Furthermore, a new enemy battalion was spotted west of the city, along with a fresh regimental headquarters just 2 kilometers north, which had at least 1 battalion stationed there. Acting on this information, elements of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division were ordered to initiate coordinated assaults on the city from their positions to the west. On February 21st, the 1st Cavalry troops launched their attack and managed to seal off the western wall of the citadel. This cut off the North Vietnamese from receiving supplies and reinforcements, leading to a quick decline in their strength within the citadel. The North Vietnamese began a rear guard action, but continued to fight fiercely for every inch of ground, sending in replacements to maintain their presence. As the 1st Cavalry advanced toward Hue from the west and battles continued within the citadel, coordinating fire support became critical. On February 21st, Brigadier General Oscar E. Davis, one of the assistant division commanders for the 1st Cavalry, arrived at the citadel to oversee the situation and take charge of fire support coordination. He set up his headquarters alongside Brigadier General Truong at the 1st ARVN Division's headquarters compound. For the final assault on the Imperial Palace, Captain John D. Notice's Company L, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, was brought in. By February 22nd, the Communists held only the southwestern corner of the citadel. Notice led his Marines along the wall to breach the outer perimeter of the palace. Once inside, they encountered fierce resistance from the entrenched Communists. Notice called for a temporary withdrawal so they could devise a new plan. While the Marines readied for their next assault on the Imperial City, it was determined that it would be politically beneficial for the palace to be liberated by the South Vietnamese. On the night of February 23 to 24, the 2nd Battalion, 3rd ARVN Regiment launched a surprise attack westward along the wall in the southeastern section of the citadel. The North Vietnamese were caught off guard at first but quickly regrouped. A brutal battle unfolded, yet the South Vietnamese pressed forward. Stripped of their supply centers to the west by the link-up between the 1st Cavalry and the 2/5th Marines, the Communists began to retreat. Amid the ground seized by the South Vietnamese was the area where the citadel flagpole stood. At dawn on the 24th, the South Vietnamese flag replaced the Viet Cong banner that had been hoisted for 25 days. Later that same day, the ARVN 1st Division reached the outer walls of the citadel and joined forces with elements of the 1st Cavalry Division. The remaining communist positions were swiftly overrun by Allied troops or abandoned by Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers, who retreated west towards sanctuaries in Laos. On March 2, 1968, the battle for Hue was officially declared over. It had been a fierce ordeal, marked as the longest sustained infantry battle of the war up to that moment. The toll was significant. Over those 26 days of conflict, the ARVN reported 384 killed, more than 1,800 wounded, and 30 missing. The U.S. Marines faced 147 dead and 857 wounded, while the U.S. Army recorded 74 dead and 507 wounded. Allied forces claimed over 5,000 communist fighters were killed in the city, with an additional estimated 3,000 dead in the surrounding area. Despite efforts by U.S. command to minimize damage to the city using precise 8-inch howitzers and naval fire, the house-to-house combat left much of the once beautiful city in ruins. In the 26 days of struggle to reclaim Hue, 40% of the city was destroyed, leading to 116,000 civilians losing their homes from a pre-Tet population of 140,000. On top of the battle damage, civilians faced horrific losses from the communist attackers, with about 5,800 reported killed or missing. In the months that followed, South Vietnamese authorities found that Viet Cong death squads had systematically targeted South Vietnamese government leaders and employees. Nearly 3,000 corpses were discovered in mass graves, many shot, bludgeoned, or buried alive, most with their hands tied behind their backs. The victims encompassed soldiers, civil servants, merchants, clergymen, teachers, intellectuals, and foreigners. It was suspected that many others also missing were executed by the Viet Cong and PVN during the battle or as they retreated from the citadel. The fighting had been fierce and bloody, yet in the end, the Allies expelled the Communists and reclaimed the city. The Battle of Hue serves as a classic example of the challenges of urban combat. Several crucial factors influenced how the battle was fought and deserve attention. These factors include intelligence, command and control, training, rules of engagement, medical support, and population control. Intelligence, or rather the absence of it, significantly affected the battle for Hue. The intelligence system failed to foresee an imminent attack on Hue. Even when there were signs of a potential assault, the warnings never reached the commanders on the ground who needed them most. Once the attack commenced, the intelligence updates could not accurately gauge enemy strength or intentions in Hue. This lack of insight severely hampered the Allied response, particularly in the early days of the battle, when both ARVN and Marines were unsure of how many enemy forces were in the city. The result was a fragmented approach, leading to units being thrown into combat against overwhelming odds. Command and control played a pivotal role as well. The division of responsibilities among ARVN, Marine, and Army forces led to poor coordination and a lack of unified effort in the attempt to reclaim the city. This was evident even before the battle kicked off. When a radio intercept revealed that an attack on Hue was imminent, the complicated command structure caused a slow reaction and meant the defenders didn't receive timely alerts. It wasn't until Brigadier General Davis assumed overall command on February 21st that the Allied forces began to work together. Until that point, they operated in isolation. The Marines followed orders from Task Force X-Ray, the ARVN responded to Brigadier General Truong's commands, and the U.S. Army troops to the west, largely unaware of the actions inside the city, acted independently. This fragmentation led to 3 separate battles occurring simultaneously without an overarching commander to unify the efforts. By the time Brigadier General Davis took control, the battle was nearly concluded. As one Marine noted, Brigadier General Davis didn't have anything to coordinate, but he had the name. The absence of a hands-on overall commander meant that there was no unified battle plan for retaking Hue. There was no one to set priorities, resolve conflicting requests for artillery and air support, or accept responsibility when things went awry. There was also no overall system in place to ensure that logistical support was distributed fairly. The Marines and Army focused on their own needs, leaving the ARVN with almost nothing. This command structure made achieving any real unity of effort extremely difficult. The command and control issues created challenges in other areas too. Without a single commander to direct the battle, it became hard to coordinate the isolation of the city from outside reinforcements, while the Marines and South Vietnamese attempted to clear it. This allowed the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong to quickly bring in replacements to offset their losses from the fierce fighting, enabling them to reinforce their ranks even as they sustained more casualties. When elements of the 1st Cavalry Division managed to seal off the city from the northwest on February 21st, it significantly influenced the battle inside. It's possible this could have been done sooner if there had been one commander to better coordinate the efforts of the units outside the city with those engaged in the fighting within it. The command and control situation also increased the risk of friendly fire due to the lack of coordination between battles on either side of the river. Additionally, the fragmented insertion of forces added to the potential for fratricide, as evidenced by the incident on February 3rd. Training played a crucial role in how the battle for Hue unfolded, especially for the Marines from TF X-Ray. The fight for the city was complicated by the Allies' lack of preparation for the type of combat required in a densely populated area like Hue. The Marines, who were vital in recapturing the city, were used to battling in jungles or open spaces rather than in urban settings. They had no training in urban warfare and had to create their own tactics, techniques, and procedures on the fly. The first 3 days of the battle were a brutal learning experience, as the Marines underwent what could be described as on-the-job training for house-to-house combat. Lacking previous experience in urban fighting, they had to learn through trial and error. The tactics that had worked so well in I Corps proved less effective in the city. The Marines needed to find new strategies to confront the entrenched enemy, who skillfully used the numerous buildings, walls, and towers. They experimented with various approaches. One effective strategy involved an 8-man team. 4 riflemen would secure the exits, while 2 rushed into the building with grenades, and 2 others provided covering fire. Responsibilities rotated among the team as they moved to the next structure. Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham, the commander of the 205th Marines, explained the tactics. Our goal is to eliminate them inside or drive them out the back while the 4 watch the exits. Then, for the next building, 2 men charge in the front. It sounds straightforward, but the timing needs to be as precise as a football play. The Marines quickly realized they required more heavy weaponry. Fire and maneuver tactics fell short in street battles without the intimidation of heavy arms. Often, objectives were only attainable by moving through buildings. Tanks, 106mm recoilless rifles, and 3.5-inch rocket launchers became vital in the house-to-house combat. The rocket launchers, commonly referred to as bazookas from World War II, were particularly portable and, according to some Marines, highly effective. The 106mm recoilless rifles were also very useful and could be deployed in 3 ways: individually, mounted on jeeps or mules, or carried by hand, despite weighing over 400 pounds when unmounted. Alternatively, they could be utilized in units of 6 on ONTOS tracked vehicles. The Marines employed these weapons to breach compound walls and building sides, allowing them to rush through. They were also invaluable for providing suppressive fire and counter-sniper actions. Tear gas became a powerful tool for driving enemy forces from their bunkers and spider holes. The Marines initially tried smoke grenades on the Treasury building south of the river, but the breeze quickly dissipated any smoke they generated. One Marine officer recommended using an E8 tear gas launcher, which he noticed stacked against the wall of an ARVN compound near the Mahi V compound. This launcher, standing about 2 feet tall, could launch up to 64 35mm tear gas projectiles, reaching distances of up to 250 meters in 4 bursts of 16 over 5 seconds each. Unlike grenades, the E-8 had the ability to saturate an entire area, ensuring that every room and bunker was filled with gas. The Marines effectively utilized the CS dispenser for the remainder of the battle, with one company commander crediting it as a key factor in reducing his casualties. In the early days of the battle, when the Marines were seeking ways to dismantle the enemy entrenched in the city, they had to navigate largely without the artillery and close air support they were used to. The rules of engagement set by the Allied senior commanders restricted artillery and close air support to protect the historic city, making it incredibly challenging for the Marines to flush the North Vietnamese out of their fortified positions. While the Marines mostly adhered to these restrictions initially, they were eventually lifted after Allies argued that following them was leading to unacceptable losses. Nicholas Warr, who served as a platoon leader in C Company 1/5th Marines during the fight for Hue, later expressed frustration, saying, "These damnable rules of engagement prevented American fighting men from using our key tactical advantage of superior firepower through airstrikes, artillery, and naval gunfire. These orders hampered our efforts and caused casualties until the 4th day of fighting inside the citadel of Hue." Due to the limitations on artillery and airstrikes, plus the fact that most available artillery from Phu Bai was aimed at stopping enemy retreats rather than targeting the city, the Marines had to rely on their mortars for close support, using them as a hammer on the buildings. Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham noted, "If you put enough mortar rounds on top of a building, eventually the roof will collapse." The mortars also became effective against enemy soldiers fleeing from the buildings the Marines were attacking. By pre-registering fire on both the target building and the street behind it, the Marines could inflict heavy casualties by shifting their fire as they pushed the enemy out. The fierce combat led to an overwhelming number of casualties. With bad weather hampering helicopter evacuations, the need for forward medical facilities quickly became clear. The 1st Marine Regiment set up a regimental aid station at the MAPV compound, staffed by 8 doctors. This facility offered emergency care and coordinated all medical evacuations. Each forward battalion also had its own aid station. Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham, the commander of 2/5th Marines, praised this prompt medical support, likening it to the practices of World War II, stating, "I had my doctor 1 block behind the front line treating the people right there." The Marines utilized trucks, mechanical mules, and any available means of transport to bring the wounded back to the aid stations. From there, Marine and Army helicopters were deployed for further evacuation, often flying at a ceiling of just 100 feet. During the battle for Hue, if a Marine reached an aid station alive, they had nearly a 99% chance of survival. The intense fighting within the city quickly led to issues with population control. In urban warfare, civilians often find themselves caught between opposing forces, and Hue was no exception. The initial attack sparked the first wave of civilians seeking refuge in the relative safety of the MACV compound. This trickle soon turned into a flood over the subsequent weeks, creating a logistical and security challenge for U.S. and South Vietnamese forces as the refugee crisis grew to staggering proportions. Each turn in the fighting brought out hundreds of Vietnamese civilians of all ages. Many families braved the shelling and street battles by huddling in small bunkers they had built in their homes. From the rubble emerged old men, women, and children, waving white cloths attached to sticks. As the battle raged on, it became essential to address the mounting flood of refugees and displaced individuals. A U.S. Army major from the Mass CV advisory team was appointed to oversee coordination of the refugee situation. Temporary housing was arranged in a complex near the Mass CV compound and at Hue University, where the refugee count ballooned to 22,000. An additional 40,000 displaced individuals were in the Citadel area across the river. While most of the refugees were innocent civilians, some were enemy soldiers. Many of the sympathizers were ARVN troops who found themselves stuck at home on leave during the Tet holidays. Those ARVN soldiers who were able to serve were quickly utilized to assist the Marines and MACV advisors in aiding the refugees. Alongside addressing the needs for refugee shelter, both U.S. and South Vietnamese officials had to work on restoring city services like water and power, tackling health hazards such as burying the dead, and securing food supplies. With help from the local Catholic community and American resources and personnel, government officials from South Vietnam endeavored to bring order and normalcy back to the city. By the end of February, a dedicated refugee administrator was appointed, and the local government gradually began to operate effectively again. To sum up, the Battle of Hue merits careful study when reflecting on the complexities and demands of urban operations. It was a fierce conflict that led to significant casualties, largely due to the reasons mentioned earlier, including failures in intelligence and a lack of centralized command and control. The determination of individual Marines and soldiers, both American and South Vietnamese, was crucial to their success against a resolute enemy in urban conditions that far surpassed anything the Allies had encountered before. However, the victory at Hue ultimately did not carry much weight in the bigger picture. Even though the Allies claimed a decisive tactical victory in the city and across other battlefields in South Vietnam, the Tet Offensive turned out to be a strategic defeat for the United States. Public opinion in the U.S. began to shift against the war, significantly influenced by media portrayals of the early days of the offensive. On March 31, 1968, the full ramifications of the Tet Offensive became clear when President Lyndon Baines Johnson announced a halt to all bombing of North Vietnam above the 20th parallel and declared he would not seek re-election for a second term. Thus, the Communists achieved a significant strategic victory. However, they lost an estimated 30,000 fighters in the process, and the Viet Cong would never fully recover. Still, the Tet Offensive led to a major shift in U.S. policy in Vietnam, prompting the United States to begin its long withdrawal from the conflict. Despite the war's outcome, the Battle of Hue remains a classic example. This study of urban warfare illustrates the intense challenges of combat in densely populated areas, highlighting the bravery and resilience required from soldiers engaged in such battles. The Marines and South Vietnamese forces reclaimed the city from the Communists, paying a heavy price in blood. Many lessons learned through hard experiences remain relevant to urban combat today, just as they were back in 1968. The Tet Offensive shook the U.S. military, but it ultimately shattered America's confidence in the war. From the ruins of Hue to the unsettled offices of Washington, this battle changed the course of everything. If you found this narrative as impactful as it is essential, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next chapter in this war's story. And if you're curious to see what happened next, how this led to Vietnamization and the U.S. withdrawal, click on the next video and keep watching.